Our next speaker is Andrew Little, a lawyer by trade and a former secretary of the EPMU. Andrew has been in Parliament since 2011. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Stephen, for the introduction. I understand we're under time constraints, so we'll get right into it. You've asked what the future might hold based on the principles and values of the Magna Carta. And the question is, in my view, a timely one. Change is needed if we want to preserve what we have come to see as the defining values of the Great Charter. Even though the bulk of the document dealt with contemporary issues, long since totally irrelevant, although tonight I've seen the relevance of the Welsh clauses being brought back to life, the two clauses that have acquired considerable force, that dealing with the rule of law and another dealing with liberty, need constant, if not eternal, vigilance in any representative democracy. The principle of the rule of law is meant to mean that no one is above the law, not even lawmakers, and that laws themselves must be made and enforced according to democratically mandated processes. What this means in New Zealand is that democratically elected members of Parliament collectively make our laws, or at least some of them. Those same MPs decide on the rules of how laws are made through the standing orders of Parliament. Other laws, in the form of delegated legislation or regulations, are made by officials and cabinet ministers under power conferred by statutes. This subordinate legislation must also be made according to the rules, the most important of which is that this type of law must be within the power granted to ministers and officials. Let's remember too that the Parliament that makes our laws in New Zealand is a single house, not two houses, as is usual in other Westminster democracies. Let's also accept that our style of parliamentary democracy is one in which ministers of the government predominantly set the agenda. The second surviving Magna Carta principle, that we should be free from undue and unjust restraint, as well as undue intrusion into our personal lives, our property, and our liberty by the Crown or State, is as justified today as it ever was. The modern state is a giant machine. This is different from a time when power was exercised by a bunch of loosely coordinated and mostly competing feudal landlords. The machinery of modern government is large and complex. It still has and needs coercive and intrusive powers to enforce the rule of law and to protect its citizens, albeit with more legislative controls than were in place when the Magna Carta was sealed. The technology available to exercise coercive powers and for surveillance is changing rapidly, making it harder to control. Surveillance technologies can be used and abused by both the state and private citizens. The challenge in a liberal democracy that champions not only personal freedom, but the need for personal and collective security is to get that balance right, more so when the threats to us are apparently growing. These principles of the rule of law and freedom from unjust restraint have, of course, spawned many more expressions of rights and protections. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights sets out many human rights and freedoms. Our own New Zealand Bill of Rights Act sets out what might be regarded as the most basic civil and political rights, all of which arguably stem from the original claim in the Charter to be free from undue restraint. Of course, history isn't as simple as drawing a line between events hundreds of years apart and declaring that they are related. The 20th century context in which these modern expressions of freedoms and rights have been made derive equally from views about humanity, what it means to be human, as well as Enlightenment ideals of equality of people and, of course, individual autonomy. But all of this simply reflects another principal achievement of the Magna Carta, the very thing that has been renegotiated repeatedly throughout history, and that is the moderation of absolute power and the redistribution of power. True, the Charter represented a shift of power from the monarch to feudal landlords who already exercised considerable and mostly unrestrained power over tenants and peasants. But it was still a change in the locus of power achieved through a struggle of sorts, basically holding London to ransom. Something that only the financial sector does these days. Other struggles in the 16th and 17th centuries between monarchs and citizens, or at least the elites amongst them, saw a greater shift towards Parliament in terms of the distribution of power. Struggles in the 19th and 20th centuries have seen a shift of power to citizens in the form of the universal franchise and electoral systems such as MMP. Moving on 800 years, the Westminster system of parliamentary government is defined by the supremacy of Parliament. It's Parliament that has the last word. It can legislate as it wishes. It's been called the highest court in the land. But is Parliament a real safeguard anymore against its own denials of freedom, which the feudal barons accused King John of? Is the due process of Parliament today robust enough to protect citizens from legislation that impinges on their rights and freedoms as citizens? Parliament can and does legislate against what we regard as fundamental human and civil rights. This most often arises in legislation dealing with search and seizure powers. We see it in legislation dealing with our security agencies. 2 years ago, immigration legislation was amended purportedly to deal with the threat of mass arrivals of refugees and created powers of detention with few or no rights of appeal and powers that go beyond anything we had seen previously. Parliament recently amended the right of habeas corpus on the grounds of judicial efficiency rather than human rights effectiveness. Even a bill dealing with something as innocent as natural health products contains significant powers of entry, search and seizure. The bill is yet to be passed into law. The only safeguards we have in the lawmaking process protecting us against the loss of basic citizens' rights is the Attorney General's certificate required for every piece of legislation, which merely brings the loss of those rights to the attention of Parliament, if that's what's in a particular bill, and MPs' own understanding of potential threats to rights and freedoms and their willingness to stand up against the loss of those rights. Attorney General certificates, especially those concluding that a piece of legislation contravenes the Bill of Rights Act, are often disregarded. The contents of a certificate might be raised in debate, but then that serves only to illustrate that this important safeguard, or what should be an important safeguard, is nothing more than a debating point. This is no safeguard at all. How can we regard the civil rights in our Bill of Rights Act as fundamental when Parliament can so easily override them? As for MPs, many struggle to keep abreast of every piece of legislation going through Parliament at any one time. Opposition parties, arguably the most important in applying critical scrutiny of legislation as it passes through the House, are far less resourced than the executive, which produces the legislation. The reality is, no single MP, and Jacinda Ardern, who is here, can correct me if I'm wrong, no single MP is across every piece of legislation going through the House at any point in time. The oversight intended by MPs cannot be guaranteed in every case. Lawmakers put themselves above the law when they pass laws contradicting widely accepted basic rights and freedoms. In doing so, they offend against the rule of law principle of the Magna Carta. We might also consider the attitudes of some MPs towards the exercise of powers by state agencies. Consider the recent statements by a former Minister of Justice defending the actions of police in misleading a court in order to secure a conviction. Where was that MP's concern for the rule of law? And even though I've talked about legislation contravening citizens' freedoms, what about when Parliament appears to be failing to provide sufficient protection of citizens' interests against threats to their security? In the Netherlands recently, the court ordered its Parliament to consider its action or inaction on climate change on the grounds that its failure to do so was a breach of its duty to protect its citizens against threats. What recourse do New Zealand citizens have, apart from civil disobedience, such as scaling up the front wall of Parliament, if they consider that Parliament is failing to properly protect their security interests, whether now or in the long term? In my view, it's time to reconsider whether at this point in our history, Parliament is capable on its own of providing an effective enough safeguard of citizens' basic rights. Some other countries, including Westminster-style democracies such as Australia and Canada, make their equivalent of the Bill of Rights Act superior law. that is, law which overrides any legislation that contradicts it, and at the same time entrenching that legislation so it can't be repealed on a simple majority. This allows their courts to declare a statutory provision in contravention of those rights to be invalid. New Zealand has studiously followed the English tradition of requiring the judiciary to apply statute law regardless of its adherence or not with basic civil rights. It's now time, in my view, to debate the recommendation of the Constitutional Advisory Panel, made at the end of 2013, to allow our courts to consider the question of compliance by statutes with basic civil rights. The panel came up with a halfway house that would see a court, rather than simply declaring a statutory provision to be invalid, declaring it to be in contravention of basic rights, and for the time being unenforceable, and then requiring Parliament to reconsider the law. The New Zealand Bill of Rights Act carries an important proviso that is used in many international conventions and agreements on civil and political rights. This is the justified limitation proviso, which accepts that there will be circumstances in which an abrogation of basic rights will be justified. This would still feature in any assessment by a court, and I can think of legislation passed recently which permits intrusion into one's person and property, but which, in my view, would meet the justified limitation test. In my view, such an arrangement would act as an effective discipline on lawmakers' powers and would act as a check and balance on lawmakers' powers that do not presently exist. Such an arrangement would amount to an acceptance of nothing more than the possibility that on rare occasions, even conscientious lawmakers can get it wrong when it comes to laws affecting basic rights. Enacting such an arrangement would give 21st century life to the 13th century Magna Carta in an ever-adapting New Zealand. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. That's a stepping up to the mark, a real visionary statement. The idea of a much more stronger rights-based review here in New Zealand law would be a profound development, and one that I've argued for in the past.